Thank you, Linda. And as Linda was saying then, yes, a lot of this research was carried out in the archives and libraries of Germany last year. This talk is going to involve quite a lot of excerpts from quite a number of letters and other writings by Liszt. If you find you're getting surfeit, then just imagine what it was like for me reading it for about 3 months, because the man produced quite a lot of correspondence. But in any case, I'll try and make it as engaging as possible. Now, this is one part of a bigger research project. So my big research project is to try and explore how a number of composers in the second half of the 19th century understood their relationship with the audience. Now, I'm interested particularly in composers who self-identified as musical progressives. In other words, they were very much felt that they were pushing forward the musical language of their time, that they were perhaps introducing new harmonic resources, that were changing forms, that were writing in programmatic veins. These and many other factors were considered progressive at that particular time. And of course, they offered challenges to audiences at that particular time. So I'm trying to understand to what extent were these composers willing the controversies that came about, or working in spite of the controversies that came about? Did they really care if anyone listened, to use Milton Babbitt's infamous phrase? These are the questions that I'm engaging with, and I will look at one particular composer today. So let me begin by sharing 2 quotations with you. These represent, I suppose, the opposite ends of the spectrum of how you might understand your relationship with the audience. The first comes from a 57-year-old composer whose sacred music had met with some success in a performance in Budapest. Commenting on this, he said, and I quote, "The approval of the public gives me a lesser opinion of myself and makes me feel my faults all the more." The second was uttered by a 29-year-old pianist who bowed to his Parisian audience's wish to hear an operatic fantasy in place of the advertised Beethoven sonata, with the words, "Je suis le serviteur du public, cela va sans dire." I am the public servant, that goes without saying. So the pianist's dependence on his listeners' approbation was so absolute that he changed his program according to their whim, and very much to the detriment of the quality, we might think. While the composer vehemently rejected audience approval as an indicator of the worth of his music. These attitudes might, I think, seem diametrically opposed, but in fact, as many of you will have already guessed, they both stem from the same man, Franz Liszt, the pianist and composer. In a concert to raise money for Beethoven's memorial in 1841, and a Beethoven concert makes it doubly ironic, he did indeed grudgingly yield to public pressure to play his reminiscences on Meyerbeer's opera Robert le Diable. And only after that did he resume the postponed performance of the Kreutzer Sonata. Similarly, after his symphonic poem Hungaria, his coronation mass, and his 137th psalm went well in an 1869 concert, he did pen those perverse lines which seemingly lament his success. So, what are we to make of these wildly disparate attitudes to the audience? If one were to try and unpick the apparently stark contradictions between the two, one would first have to acknowledge that the two incidents are 28 years apart, and some shifting in one's views over such an extended time span is perhaps not unexpected. Second, the two statements are not made from the same perspective. In the first, Liszt was speaking as a performer, and in the later one, as a composer. Concert etiquette in the 1840s was not as rigid as it is today, and as a pianist, Liszt was known to try to appease audiences even at the cost of what we would regard as musical propriety. In his heyday as a touring virtuoso, for example, he was not above adding flashy ornaments when performing Beethoven sonatas, which of course is utterly anathema today. But even if this explains perhaps his attitudes in 1841, in other words, why he might have bowed to the whim of the public, it surely leaves open to question why he would disdain success in 1869. A composer usually doesn't have to negotiate with the public in the same face-to-face way that a performer does, but hearing that one's works went well would surely be a cause for gratification, not self-condemnation. So in my talk today, I want to examine why Liszt would have been capable of this kind of rejection of public opinion. I will examine not only the composer's personal experiences in the intervening years, but also how he understood his compositional mission, which was shaped by his belief in the inevitability of progress. So, let me begin by noting the major watershed in Liszt's biography: his apparently quixotic decision to quit public performance at the height of his powers in 1847. So after a final concert in Elisabethgrad in Russia in September of that year, the 35-year-old pianist quit his life as a touring virtuoso and shortly after settled in Weimar, a smallish city in Thuringia without any great musical tradition. There were, in fact, some compelling reasons for this abrupt change of course. Chief among them, the conviction that devoting himself to composition was a more worthy artistic vocation than continuing his series of triumphs as one of the finest performers in Europe. Moreover, turning his back on immediate fame and glory was not an entirely disinterested decision. Liszt was well aware that as a composer, he might hope to have a more lasting impact on the public memory than he or indeed any performer could in the days before recorded sound. The English novelist George Eliot made a similar point when she wrote about her visit to Liszt in Weimar a few years later. It seems to be understood that we may write the more freely of our personal admiration for musical and dramatic artists, because their fame does not live after them, except for a few short years in the eulogies of their superannuated contemporaries. It is possible, she goes on to say, that Liszt will turn out to be something more than one of these coruscating meteors who come, are seen, and are extinguished in darkness. He is now devoting himself to composition and may, perhaps, produce something perennial. Now, not that Liszt, by the way, waited until he retired from performing to begin composing. During his years as a performer, he had produced a slew of piano works for his own use. These mainly included things like arrangements of operatic tunes and other well-known pieces. He also wrote quite a lot of virtuoso pieces to impress the listener. However, he had bigger ambitions as a composer that extended beyond writing for his own instrument. Conquering the more important genres, and in those days they would have included orchestral music and stage composition, these would cement his legacy as a composer of true stature. And indeed, I'm just going to jump a little bit forward now, over the 13 years in Weimar, he did indeed create a substantial body of orchestral works, as well as definitive versions of several of his piano pieces that were even begun earlier. Despite many abortive attempts, he never completed a mature opera, but instead wrote a number of significant works for chorus and orchestra, among them his two most important oratorios, the Legend of St. Elizabeth and also Christus, and several mass settings, among which the kind of Festmesse is generally considered the most important. Incidentally, if Liszt's decision to choose the difficult path of composer over the easy way of the virtuoso, and I understand, of course, the virtuoso has its own challenges, but for Liszt, he had surmounted and transcended those. In any case, choosing this difficult path, if this seems familiar, it's probably because the choice of virtue over ease has been enshrined in thousands of maxims and mythic archetypes. In Greek mythology, for instance, Heracles was famously confronted with two women, one of whom offered him a life of pleasure, but obscurity, and the other a way to glory which would involve much hardship. The fact that we could still talk about Hercules or Heracles these days indicates that he indeed chose the harder, more difficult path, the one that led to lasting fame. In the moral sphere, the same message is conveyed in gospel verses which run, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction. But narrow is the gate and difficult the way that leads to life, and there are few who find it." In the world of music, one of the most memorable versions of this story is found in Schoenberg's 1948 essay, On revient toujours, where he says, I was not destined to continue in the manner of transfigured night, or Guralieder, or even Peleas et Melisande. The supreme commander had ordered me on a harder road. Now, a not insignificant role in Liszt's decision to retire was arguably also played by the woman he met at this crucial juncture of his life, Caroline von Zehn-Wittgenstein. Although she was unhappily married when she encountered Liszt in 1847, they formed an instant bond, and shortly after Liszt arrived in Weimar, she moved there with her daughter to be with him, and they lived together for 13 years in that city. The subsequent course of their relationship was not entirely happy. They tried to get married in Rome in 1861, but through the machinations of a senior Vatican figure whose brother had married Caroline's daughter, it was called off at the 11th hour. Nonetheless, her importance in Liszt's life in the Weimar years can hardly be underestimated. For one thing, she is known to have co-authored quite a lot of the writings that appeared under his name. And anytime he was apart from her, he sends her detailed letters, keeping her up to date. So as a resource for scholars, their correspondence is one of the most important things we have. It was Liszt himself who credited her with inspiring him to renounce the ephemeral satisfactions of the touring virtuoso life and choose the more difficult path. He says, "You gave me the wise counsel of completely breaking with my servitude to the public." Aside from his legacy-building aspirations, Liszt also found the act of writing down his ideas deeply satisfying. Indeed, it was something of a psychological necessity for him. After an enforced 15-day hiatus when traveling, he wrote, "I have a real need to write music to keep me in balance. I feel parched when I go several days without manuscript paper. My brain swells, and I become incapable of taking pleasure in external things. I've often noticed this, and this type of illness has increased over the years. Music is the breath of my soul. It is at once my prayer and my work." This element of compulsion isn't generally considered when analyzing Liszt's motives for persisting to create in the face of opposition, but surely his self-diagnosed mania for composition, they're his words, at least should be acknowledged. Nonetheless, in his own mind, and I think in most of ours, his works had the value beyond just being therapeutic. In any case, when Liszt settled in Weimar with the intention of establishing himself as a composer, he was prepared for an extended campaign. For one thing, his grasp on orchestration was fairly rudimentary, and in the early years, he had to seek assistance with the scoring of his ideas from August Conradi and Joachim Raff. With their help, of course, over time, he mastered these skills and indeed now counts as one of the more interesting orchestrators of the 19th century. He also benefited hugely from the chance to try out his works with the tame orchestra that he had at his disposal. It took, in fact, 9 years after he settled in Weimar for him to produce his first set of symphonic poems, which are part of the legacy that he created in these years, although several earlier incarnations did circulate a little bit before this. But in any case, there were more fundamental reasons why Liszt anticipated that he might not win mass appeal straight away. These come down to, on the one hand, the makeup of the audiences of the day and the nature of the task that he set himself as a composer. Now, the two factors are closely related, but to make it easier, I'm just going to analyze them separately in what follows. So let's look first at the audiences. Even during his glory days as the most feted virtuoso pianist in Europe, Liszt knew the limitations of his listeners. In large public concerts, he offered pieces that utilized familiar tunes, such as his fantasies and paraphrases on opera excerpts, and works that wowed the hearers with their overt virtuosity. He tended to reserve more demanding fare for salons and other semi-private performances when surrounded by cognoscenti. For instance, he's often credited as giving the first public performance of Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata in 1836 in Paris, but in fact that was not really an official public concert at all. And when he did perform Beethoven sonatas, as he did sometimes in the 1840s, they sometimes only consisted of a selection of movements, For example, in 1842 in Berlin, in a public concert, he again did perform the Hammerklavier Sonata, but he only gave 2 movements, not the 4. Liszt's practical strategies testify to the truth of what Friedrich Rochlitz had noticed in 1828. We must consider the public as belonging to 2 very different classes in regard to music, much as in regard to reading matter and many other things, according to sensibility and inclination. The first only wants to amuse itself with music, whether hearing or practicing it, to create an agreeable pastime. The second wants, as regularly as possible, to excite, reanimate, uplift, strengthen, and advance its whole inner person. Liszt used strikingly similar language in the 1842 preface to his Album d'un Voyageur. This was the work that was later revised as the Swiss volume of his Année de Pèlerinage. He acknowledged that the album was intended for the few rather than for the many. He was not ambitious of success, but of the approval of that minority which conceives art as having other uses than the beguiling of idle hours, and asks more from it than the futile distraction of a passing entertainment. More broadly, he stated that music has its hidden meaning, its ideal sense, unsuspected by the majority. For where a work of art is concerned, the majority does not rise beyond a comparative criticism of externals and a facile appreciation of certain superficial skills. That's quite a damning view on the majority of his listeners. So here I think perhaps we can see the roots of his later distrust of the audience. If music that was more than just passing entertainment could not easily win over the majority, then the acclaim of the masses was no measure of quality. Where the old adage, vox populi, vox dei, saw public endorsement as evidence of divine approval and by extension of objective merit, Liszt is consciously uncoupling the two. We're not yet at the point where popular acceptance becomes de facto a damning judgment on artistic quality, in other words, that you're selling out by having people like your music, but the groundwork has been laid for what would become the radical anti-populism of the 20th century avant-garde. There is one other crucial factor in Liszt's understanding of the audience that must be considered here: the audience's potential to change over time. The boundaries between the uncomprehending majority and the appreciative minority were not fixed forever. Rather, as time went by, the circle of those who could relate to a specific work was bound to widen. This was an article of faith for many in the 19th century, and one which relied on recent historical precedents, most obviously the reception of Beethoven's late works. Initially considered esoteric pleasures at best, or as evidence of the composer's decline at worst, these works slowly won greater recognition as masterpieces. Writing in 1855 about Beethoven's oeuvre in general, Liszt asked rhetorically, "Did it not take 30 years for the concert halls to fill with love for him?" The initial misunderstandings and eventual triumph of artistic greatness was for Liszt part of the natural order of things, long before his own experiences might have cued him to hope for a brighter future in compensation for present disappointments. As early as 1838, he began an essay with the terse epigram, "Struggle, sorrow, and glory, the destiny of a genius." In a letter of 1849 to Karl Reinecke about Schumann's opera Genoveva, he said the following: "I am very much afraid that Schumann will have a struggle with the difficulties and delays which usually occur in trying to get any lofty work performed. One would say that a bad fairy, in order sometimes to counterbalance the works of genius, gives a magic success to the most vulgar works and presides over the propagation of them, favoring those whom inspiration has disdained, in order to push its elect into the shade. That is no reason for discouragement, for what does it matter, sooner or later?" Liszt's most extended musings on the problem of reception are found in the first part of his almost book-length essay, Harold in Italy, from 1855. Now, here Liszt goes beyond merely acknowledging the fact that the works of his more adventurous contemporaries frequently met with opposition. He offers some reflections on why this might be the case. Only insufficiency could force music to a standstill. Before the dawn of each of its new phases, however, there never fails to be proclamations of its imminent degeneration and complete downfall. The noble, enviable ill fortune of every musical genius is always to be unfamiliar, not just in itself, but as an inseparable component of true inspiration. Genius and inspiration are one and the same thing. Inspiration and innovation, however, go beyond what is known, so that they appear foreign to many eyes. In the face of this strangeness come many difficulties, for one needs to distinguish between cases where this strangeness is only the recourse of spiritual poverty, a mask behind which an empty face is hiding, and those cases where it is the indispensable consequence of a new way of feeling and the form that arises of necessity from this. Only refined minds can discern this, and it is left to the future to confirm what these have discerned. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start with Liszt's assumption that genius has to manifest itself in innovation. This might seem like a self-evident proposition to us, but in fact, it is based on a particular conception of how time operates and how change occurs that really only emerged shortly before Liszt's day. Now, summarizing a complex matter very briefly, this will be another chapter of the monograph in progress, pre-modern Western societies operated on an understanding of temporality that was strongly conditioned by cyclical patterns in nature and by aspects of Christian belief. Even human societies were seen to follow the same growth, maturity, and eventual decline curve that dominates, of course, biological organisms. According to the conceptual historian Reinhard Koselleck, the idea of progress as a widespread transpersonal force really only emerged in the 18th century, when it caught on as a means of explaining the increasingly rapid pace of change of society ushered in by developments such as the Industrial Revolution. So it was only from this time forward that there was a tendency to read human history as tracing an overall ameliorative course. In other words, things getting better all the time. And such that any declines that one observes were only offset by correspondingly greater leaps forward. And I think, unless one is very, very strongly committed to a postmodern sensibility, we still live within that particular sort of mindset. Liszt is making an analogous argument then for the development of music, although he isn't even willing to concede that periods of decline actually occur. All he says is that some doomsayers proclaim as much before art enters a new phase. Now, while change in music is inevitable, Liszt nonetheless does not accept every innovation as being equally worthy. So there are criteria of quality. The distinction between empty novelties and those stemming from genuine artistic need may only be apparent to the discerning few at the time, but as he says, with the passage of time, the picture will become clear for everyone. Now, in analyzing this last quotation from Liszt, we've moved beyond dealing with reception on its own and into the area of creation. The main outlines of Liszt's own artistic philosophy have been much studied, so all I'm going to offer here is a very brief summary of some of the most important points. During the time he spent in Weimar, Liszt embraced a particularly radical agenda, both as a composer and in his role as a conductor. He gave world premieres of works by Wagner, Berlioz, and Schumann, Raff, and many others, and was active as a pamphleteer and propagandist. His own self-description as an advanced sentinel for the art brings out the twin ideas of military conflict and Liszt's role on the front lines. There was, in fact, an intense musico-political struggle in Germany in the third quarter of the 19th century, to which Alan Walker has given the catchy title, War of the Romantics. The side to which Liszt was a known adherent was known by various names, the most suggestive of which for our purposes is Zukunftsmusik, music of the future. The origins of the term are to be found in Wagner's widely discussed 1849 pamphlet, Das Kunstwerk der Zukunft, the artwork of the future, in which Wagner laid out his vision for a collective artwork that would unite not just the separate arts, but altogether bring multiple artists and creators together in a kind of utopian socialist project. Of course, Wagner ended up doing most of the work himself, with regards to writing the poetry and the music and planning a lot of the acting on the stage, etc. Those who rejected Wagner's ideas mocked them by using the term Zukunftsmusik as a way of indicating that these ideas had no currency or validity at the time. For instance, Schumann wrote on one occasion, "But where are Liszt's ingenious achievements? Where are they hiding? Perhaps in his desk? Does he perhaps want to wait for the future, since he fears he cannot be understood right now?" This was before Liszt started publishing his symphonic poems. So that 9-year gap left many people a chance to sort of say, well, you talk a good game, but, where's the evidence? Show us the music. In a familiar move, of course, the term music of the future was reclaimed from being an insult into being a badge of honor and served as the slogan for the movement of which Wagner was a leader in exile and Liszt very much the guiding spirit in Germany. Wagner even wrote an 1860 essay with this direct title. So, what specifically were the innovations that Liszt held to be necessary to the true course of musical development? Again, these are well known, so for my purposes today, I look at just one type of work stemming from the Weimar years, which conveniently brings together several important strands. This is the symphonic poem. Now, as a genre, this was Liszt's own invention, inspired by his belief that a poetic subject, and I quote again, is one of the steps forward which the art of music still has to take. So inspiration by a poetic idea is core here. This poetic subject was conveyed to the audience in the form of a program. Now again, he's doing nothing absolutely new here. Berlioz did exactly the same thing with the Symphonie Fantastique as early as 1830. But nonetheless, this is part of the nature of the symphonic poem. Liszt also reserved the right to shape the structure of his works according to the needs of his poetic design. And this resulted in some fairly unorthodox layouts of his compositions. Furthermore, again in the service of the poetic idea, justifies everything, doesn't it? Liszt would employ novel harmonic and textural resources. Any one of these things was potentially controversial. Taken together, they constituted a declaration of war on the status quo. And Liszt knew as much. When he had finished what would be published a couple of years later as his first symphonic poem, it's entitled Ce qu'on entend sur la montagne, or also the Berg Symphony, which means what one hears on the mountains, or the Mountain Symphony. He wrote, "I'm expecting all sorts of horrors from the critics and the public, given the present state of affairs. It's not going to be a question of having fun. Even if they treat me rather crudely, I'm not going to let it trouble me." Okay, brave words. That he wasn't being unduly pessimistic in 1854 is borne out by a statement 13 years later, during which time this piece had been performed on a few occasions, but it was having another performance at the Musicians' Assembly in 1867. And this is what he said about the same piece. "Ce qu'on entend sur la montagne concerns me a bit. Not that I want to disown this work, but because the time for hearing what I had in my ear when I wrote it down does not seem to have arrived." Even then. With so much of Liszt's energies directed towards achieving artistic immortality in spite of contemporary disappointments in the 1850s, it is perhaps no surprise that several of his works from this era thematize the idea of some final vindication after some form of conflict. Now, many of these works, of course, can be seen to be descendants of Beethoven's 5th and 9th symphonies, which very much compose out this through struggle to victory archetype. For example, Liszt's Mazeppa again follows this particular trajectory. The story of the poem on which it was based is of a man who was strapped naked to the back of a wild horse and driven out into the desert to die of thirst and presumably possibly broken bones. But he managed to survive. And then at the end of it, it says, of Hugo's poem, it says, il se lève roi. He gets up as king. So in other words, there's a triumph at the end there. Now, of course, you can read any number of works as illustrating any number of sort of schemata. But I think there is one particular tone poem where we do get a very direct sense of Liszt composing out of his current situation as an embattled artist. This is his second tone poem, Tasso, Lamento e Trionfo. In his preface, Liszt explicitly linked the musical design with the reception of a great artist. This is the 16th century poet, Torquato Tasso. So, here is his preface. He says, Tasso loved and suffered in Ferrara. He was revenged in Rome. His glory is still alive in the popular songs of Venice. These three moments are inseparable from his imperishable memory. To render them in music, we first evoked the grand shadow of the hero as it haunts the lagoons of Venice even today. Next, his lordly and sad figure appeared to us as it glides along the feasts of Ferrara, where he gave birth to his masterpieces. Finally, we followed him to Rome, the eternal city, which, in holding forth to him his crown, glorified him as martyr and poet. Now, the sufferings to which Liszt obliquely refers include both political and mental troubles, which the poet underwent. He was even confined to a madhouse for 7 years. However, as this little summary suggests, late in life, his star was in the ascendant again. The Pope nominated him Poet Laureate, an honour literally involved being crowned with laurels. As you can see, the diagram, which is an early 20th century, nothing authentic about it, shows those laurels there. So hence, he was, of course, vindicated, but unfortunately, he died before the actual coronation could take place. So hence Liszt's description of him, I think, as a martyr. So I'm going to let you hear just the beginning of this, a theme early from the beginning of this work, and then the same theme coming back at the end. And I think you'll hear there a musical example of how this theme itself gets glorified. Okay, and then here's the ending version of the same. appears to die down. Good. The kind of triumphal conclusion that we've heard here is found in a vast array of other works by Liszt in a variety of genres, so much so that it has been dismissed as his apotheosis fad by unsympathetic 20th century scholars. His habit of ending with a bang rather than a whimper surely goes back to his days as a performer, when it made practical sense to conclude a performance or improvisation in a blur of flying fingers so as to elicit a stormy ovation. And while to our ears these gestures may have the taint of excess to them, what Alexander Reding calls bad 19th century monumentality, I think they're secretly and undeniably exciting, and were surely crafted to appeal to the audiences of his day. Now, despite his renunciation of the virtuoso lifestyle, Liszt still found himself heavily involved in performances throughout the 1850s. He refrained from playing the piano in public concerts, but instead was active as a conductor. As he explained it to Caroline, his involvement on the podium, particularly with his own works, wasn't so much a matter of choice as of necessity. So he travelled to a particular city to perform a work, and this is what he says. "I'm afraid that without my participation, things will go a little awry, and as a result, will not produce the impression I wanted and felt. In all I do, I believe I have something new to say. Therefore, it is essential that my thoughts and my feelings are taken on board, so that things aren't betrayed by a ruinous performance. Karlsruhe taught me a very valuable lesson in this matter, and I will try to learn from it. To a lesser degree than Wagner, I still need men and artists, and cannot put up with the usual drill and a mechanically regular performance." Now, this necessity of his participation was at times irritating and a bit of a burden to him, leading him to wish on at least one occasion that he had been made a painter who could, and I quote, "stay peacefully at home working without having to mix with all the world's discordant hubbub." And the next quotation, as you can see, I probably won't read it all there, but nonetheless, he is again emphasizing the whole sort of tedium of having to drag himself onto what he calls the human anthill. He would much rather be nicely removed from the action, able to be like the writer or the sculptor or the painter, who have their materials, but there's no necessary intervention and performance before the work can be perceived by an audience. The conducting assignments were only part of the duties that he imposed upon himself. Several other activities were needed in order to create a public for his music. The battle for hearts and minds of the music-loving audiences was also carried out in the press. Liszt wrote a substantial number of essays defending his position. On the other side lay a number of critics who were implacably hostile to the new direction, among whom the best known nowadays is Edward Hanslick, who wrote for Vienna's Neue Freie Presse. I was interested to discover recently, before an important Berlin performance, and I think it happened again in Vienna, Liszt was invited to a splendid supper by his publisher, Heinrich Schlesinger, so that he could talk to what he later described as, quote, "the cocks of the opposition criticism, Cossack, Linder, and another 20 or so others, who belong to the party that is hostile to the Zukunftsmusik." So this schmoozing with the opposition was supposed to give Liszt a chance to explain his artistic program, which indeed he did, although, and I haven't yet finished reading the reviews that these people wrote, because they're in, some of them in rather obscure journals, it doesn't seem to have made all that big a difference. There weren't too many people saying, "Oh yeah, when you get to know Liszt, he was absolutely marvelous company, he's a really good guy and I love his music now." In any case, he was given a toast. One person toasted him at this particular meal, and he responded with the following: "Higher than the artist is art. It was as a ruling artist that I left Berlin. I have come back as a servant of art." Now, this is an allusion to the ecstatic reception he had received in the city as a pianist in 1842. Another of my things that I found during my sabbatical trip was the coloured version of this. I've only ever seen it in black and white. Those little things up at the top there, these These are kisses being blown to him by the monadic crowd there beneath him. But in any case, when he left the city, this will just give you some idea of the public furore about the thing, the king and queen saw him off. He was left in a carriage drawn by 6 horses, which I believe is quite a lot, attended by milling crowds, student processions, and the University of Berlin marked the day by suspending its classes. That really doesn't happen in universities when composers arrive in town nowadays. All this led one observer to say that he left the city not like a king, but as a king. Now, this is not the place, I'm already running quite short of time, to trace the vicissitudes of Liszt's reception through the 1850s. The short summary is there are some successes, probably more failures, lots of issues with performers, and consistently negative responses from quite a proportion of the critical body. The influence of this last named group should not be underestimated. One of Liszt's disciples at the time, a man called Alexander Ritter, reported later to Richard Strauss that well-disposed audiences would sometimes second-guess themselves following the appearance of savage critiques in the newspapers. And you can see the story up there. But the idea is that they were really enthused at the time, read terrible things the next morning, and then they decided, oh, well, we must have been mistaken, and therefore didn't launch themselves in. Now, again, purely anecdotal. Strauss is writing this in about 1940, having heard the story in 1886 from a guy who was remembering it from about 30 years beforehand. But nonetheless, there probably is some substratum of truth in it all. In any case, it was a wearing existence, and eventually Liszt decided that he had had enough. The beginning of the end was when an opera by his protege, Peter Cornelius, was booed off in Weimar. Liszt took it personally and resigned from director of the opera. And a few years later, he decided he was going to cut his ties entirely with Weimar. His bitterness at how he had been treated by the press and by some of the public found an outlet in a letter to a friend around this time. If, when I settled here in 48, I had wished to attach myself to the posthumous party in music, associated myself with its hypocrisy, cherished its prejudices, etc., I would certainly have gained outwardly in consideration and acceptance. And those very newspapers which now find fit to heap insults and abuse upon me would have vied with one another in singing my praises. But such was not to be my lot. Think of the Supreme Commander again. My conviction was too sincere, my belief in the present and the future of art, at once too ardent and too positive to allow me to put up with the empty abjuratory formulae of our pseudo-classicists, who do their utmost to cry out that art is going astray, that art is lost. Now, on leaving Germany, he settled in Rome initially and devoted himself to the composition of religious works, and indeed to religion in general. It was during this next few years that he took his minor's orders in the priesthood. This change of scene and activity is less discussed in the literature than his decision to settle in Weimar, but if anything, I think it marks a more radical retreat from public life. Now, the next few slides, which I'm going just to rattle through, I'm just going to point out a couple of things on them, show just how he was rationalizing this particular decision. The first thing that he says to Caroline, just after, around the time he was leaving, was that I've done as much as I can in Germany. I've had a few successes, but it isn't good enough. They're only intermittent. What I need to do is I need to sort of step back and maybe then later relaunch myself. At this particular point also, he was in a better position to do that. When he moved to Weimar, remember, he didn't really have any experience writing for the orchestra. Now, after 13 years conducting, hearing, writing his pieces, he felt that he was in better command of the technical details. The way he puts it is, I had learned how to handle the musical dough while in Weimar, so therefore he could perhaps compose a little more in isolation without having to need to try his music out all the time. Again, we have a lot of the same arguments coming up again and again. I want to retreat. I want to stay away from the hurly-burly of the public. I just need time and space to compose my music. Now, perhaps the very vehemence with which he made these remarks, and by golly, they do dot through his correspondence, is an indicator that he was trying to convince himself. In fact, this year, 1864, the year in which he's saying, yes, this is exactly what I want to do, he returned to Paris and to Germany and remained away from Rome for more than 4 months. The following year, he had a 5-week trip to Budapest, during which time he had quite a few conducting engagements. You see his natty new dress there, of course, as Abbé Liszt. And the year after, in 1866, he returned again to Paris and Amsterdam, staying there about 2 months. And of course, he was plunging into society, he was catching up with his friends, but of course, for our purposes, what was interesting is that he got involved in so many performances, having said enough is enough in 1861. From 1868, in fact, he began what's now known as his vie trifurcée, his 3-pronged life, where he spent some of the year in Rome, though usually as little as he could get away with. He spent some of the year in Weimar and then some of the year in Budapest. And again, we have this idea that, he keeps saying to Carolyn, I keep getting dragged into these particular things. I don't want to. If anything I could get out of them, I would. But he keeps getting dragged in. Now, as far as I would interpret it, the gentleman doth protest too much. I think he got involved in these public activities because he felt he had to. Not just because he felt he had to, but because at some level he wanted to. The life of the recluse really wasn't for Liszt. He thrived on human interactions. Now, just before I proceed to my conclusions, I'm just going to let you talk very briefly, very, very briefly, about Liszt's late piano works, because they do lend us a different set of insights onto his attitudes towards the audience in just the last 5 years of his life. Now, these are highly experimental miniatures, a world removed from the kind of pomp that you heard in his Weimar symphonic poem. The tone of the works is suggested by Alan Walker's categorization of them into 3 groups: music of retrospection, music of despair, and music of death. Nothing particularly jolly about these. Only some of them were published in his lifetime. Some he deliberately held back. He said the world isn't ready for them. Now, what I'm going to play for you is not one of the best known of these quite less well-known works. I'm going to avoid the Nuage Gris, and instead I'm going to pick something which, by its title, is interesting and I think in some ways paradoxical. It's called a Marche Triomphale, a triumphal march, a Siegesmarsch. I'll let you hear it and then I'll just comment briefly on it. So, I don't know how it would appeal to you. For me, the triumphal gestures are deliberately hollow and unconvincing. I believe Liszt is invoking the idea of victory and triumph only to undercut it. Now, we do know that Liszt was in poor health around this period, and he had various other reasons for depression and unhappiness. As a whole, then, I think the late works were not intended for his contemporaries, but for a potential listenership that did not yet exist. One of his most quoted declarations on this matter seems to sum up the motivations behind these strange last works. My sole ambition as a musician was and will be to hurl my javelin into the indefinite realm of the future. As we used to say once upon a time in Brendel's journal, this is the Neue Zeitschrift, which was the main organ for the Progressive Party. So long as the javelin is true and does not fall back to earth, the rest doesn't matter to me at all. And so, to some conclusions. So, what can we conclude about Liszt's attitudes towards the audience? It seems to me that by temperament and training, Liszt was not particularly suited to the solitary existence he claimed was his dream. His gregarious and generous person seemingly thrived on interactions with others, whether in his capacity as performer, teacher, or colleague. Moreover, the appetite for public acclaim, which had been fostered during his virtuoso years, never really left him. True, he gave up the career which would have allowed him to coast through life on a wave of adulation, but ultimately he was exchanging this for recognition in another field that he hoped would be more lasting. And anyway, he had his students around him and they worshipped him, so he got it in sort of smaller doses from his coterie. By the end of his life, he had consciously embraced a spare, alienated style, a deliberate gamble that these experimental works would be valued if the course of music developed in a particular way. And to some extent, he was right. Almost totally ignored at the time, pieces such as Nuage Gris were rediscovered in the 20th century and were valued as early instances of post-tonal composition. His orchestral works have also achieved a significant position in the musicological canon, although with one or two potential exceptions, they've never really become part of the regular repertoire for most orchestras. At least I've been watching the SSO programs for 5.5 years and I've never seen a single one. Perhaps inevitably, the part of Liszt's oeuvre which is played most often is his output for piano. Now, we shouldn't get too caught up in the irony of Liszt having quit playing the piano to establish a reputation as a composer, which in the end largely centres on his piano works. In fact, he did need to quit performance because, first of all, the final versions of a lot of his piano pieces only happened in the time when he was away from performance in the Weimar years. And secondly, masterpieces like the B minor sonata only originated in this particular period. A few years before his death, Liszt wrote, "For my humble part as an artist, I try to serve the public in a noble fashion, without thought of gain or loss, whether by flattering it or insulting it." The echo of his notorious 1840 remark, "I am the servant of the public," is striking, but still more important are the differences. Liszt no longer feels he has to indulge the audience's every whim, but neither is he maintaining the pretense of ignoring it altogether, as he frequently did in the 1860s. And ultimately, the audiences of the future have responded by continuing to find something of value in what he left. He may never have been a contender for inclusion in the top 10 composers feature in the New York Times back in 2011. And the music editor, Anthony Tomasini, noted that in all the vociferous debates surrounding the final selection, there were, quote, surprisingly few calls to include him in this select group. However, as one caricaturist recognized some years after his death, Liszt has nonetheless managed to win his place in the Pantheon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you picked that one out. I might not have spotted it. Now, we do have time for just a few questions, but as usual, everybody is invited to join us after the talk for some refreshments and some informal chats, including with our presenter. So can I just call for 2 or 3 questions? Or even one. Yes?
Thanks, Dave. That was really dense, but excellent. I just wanted to ask, where do you think, well, you probably know this because it's going to be your extra chapter, another chapter in your book, but where would Liszt have been reading about these ideas of progress as, I know it was all current, but can you be a bit more specific?
I've been trying to sort of find that out there. I think it's fair to say that, he didn't make any special studies of any particular authors. My feeling is that, at least in one of his writings, there's a footnote to Hegel. Now, that will be, of course, the most obvious place to try and find some of these ideas about the discourse of progress. However, we can never be sure if that was a footnote that he put in or Caroline put in. But again, he was talking to her, so he got at least Hegelianism at second hand, if at worst there. But again, I think just a lot of these ideas were in the air. He was probably as much influenced by the precedents that he was seeing musically as he was by any particular sort of, authors or philosophers. I found a really fascinating trove of articles from about 1848 in the German musical press, just when he was settling in Weimar. There's one from January 1848 called Fortschritt, called Progress. And this effectively says, it begins off with, everyone's talking about progress, everyone claims to be progressive these days, which will just perhaps give you some idea of the density of discourse on this. So again, I don't know that he ever made a systematic study of any of the authors on this, but he was a believer in sort of the writing. He was acquainted with the writings of Lamennais and the like, so I've yet to explore if they really have a firm discussion of progress or these issues. Conducting the I think it was August, but I couldn't swear to you which. I can certainly find it. Yes, just don't retain it in my head. There was a lot of dates. Yeah, I think it was August in that year.
poem was like an invention that Liszt invented, right? How much does it differ from like the classical symphony structure, like the four movements?
Sure. The short answer is it attempts to, in some ways, take the place of the classical symphony. Liszt also wrote multi-movement symphonies, but the symphonic poem, in a way, condenses the four-movement or the multi-movement symphony into one movement. So one of the characteristics of its form that a lot of people have noted is the fact that you get, within the unbroken span of one movement, you get a fast section, you get a slow section, you get a bit that sounds a little more scherzo-like and possibly a fast section. It's not always as perfect as that, but nonetheless there are different movement types found within it. So in a way, he was offering a kind of condensed alternative to the symphony. So you didn't have to worry about, am I writing a symphony that's as good as Beethoven's anymore? You could say, no, I'm doing something different, but it's in a way succeeding on different grounds, of course, because the most important thing is the poetic inspiration. Except the last. Von der Wiege, quite right, yes, that's a considerably later work and in some ways. I'm glad to hear someone endorsing Liszt's like music. It's rare enough that it happens.
Without question, greatest musician of the 19th century. I was once the greatest composer, although I think best known thinking. He wrote a lot of rubbish, but he was as pianist, as a thinker, as a conductor, as a composer, the greatest musician of his century.
I think it's fair to say that he's probably the most rounded and probably the person who encouraged most. If we were to measure a composer's achievement not by the compositions they produced, but by the other things that they sort of furthered and fostered, I mean, composers like Grieg and Smetana and the Russian school like Bachtrack, they all owed a huge debt to Liszt and acknowledged it. He sort of advised people on their compositions. He just encouraged them. He provided a model for them. So yes, in many ways, Jack, you are right. He was possibly the most important musician of the 19th century, even though I think only some of his music gets really into the top rank.
Well, on that note, I think we need to draw this phase of the event to a close. Thanks very much, David. I'm really looking forward to reading